Hey, welcome back to Critical Thinking. We're about to start a series of videos focusing on inductive reasoning and things like scientific method. We're going to start with this initial video focusing on the basics of inductive reasoning, specifically the different types of inductive arguments, the differences between induction and deduction, and focus a bit of our time on analogy. Some of this is going to be review, but some of it will be new. So why don't we go ahead and take a look. As I said, we're going to be focusing today on the basics. And before I actually get to inductive arguments, I want to spend a little bit of time taking a look at induction and deduction. This is going to be a review, and I want to distinguish the two of them. Remember that there are two types of logic, right? Formal and informal. Formal logic deals with deductive arguments. Informal logic deals with inductive arguments. And the main way to distinguish them is to do that with respect to how their conclusions follow from their premises. Deductive arguments end in a conclusion that has certainty and follows necessarily. Inductive arguments end in a conclusion that has a degree of probability but never necessary truth. Also worth pointing out is that an inductive argument is going to be any argument that is not deductive, which will include things like abductive, ampliative, and so on. Now, even though that is the critical difference between the two types of arguments, we could unpack the distinctions a bit further. Induction is often described as moving from the specific to the general, or from the particular to the universal. Observations about this particular falling body to universal descriptions like the law of gravity. And deduction from the general to the specific, or from the universal to the particular. So if all oak trees emerged from acorns, then this particular oak tree must have emerged from an acorn. But there are exceptions, and this description doesn't actually hold up in every case, as I think we're going to see shortly. We could also refer to how the premises support their conclusion. So in an inductive argument, the premises can strengthen or weaken the argument, whereas in a deductive argument, the premises provide absolute support for the conclusion. Induction also has a conclusion that is supported by the premises but not implied. And the conclusion may contain information that's actually not present in the premises at all. Whereas in deduction, the conclusion is completely contained in the premises. You're not going to get anything new in the conclusion that you don't already have in the premises that you begin with. In induction, if all premises are true, then the conclusion might still be false. In deduction, if the premises are true, and it's a valid argument, then the conclusion must be true. It's not even possible for it to be false. Hence the strength of a deductive argument over an inductive argument. With induction, the addition of a new premise can affect the probability of the conclusion. It can strengthen it, it can weaken it. In deduction, the addition of a new premise can in no way affect the support that the initial premises provide for the conclusion. And in an inductive argument, the strength of the argument rests on its content or the matter, whereas in a deductive argument, the strength of the argument rests on its structure or its form. I know it's been a while since we've used the term validity, but I have a feeling you can all recall that it's a desirable quality in an argument. The question is, how can we have a valid inductive argument? And I've actually answered that question in a previous video. In short, the answer is simply inductive arguments cannot be valid. Validity is a characteristic of formal logic, not informal logic, and only a deductive argument can be valid. It's redundant actually to say deductively valid. If it's valid, it's got to be deductive. An argument is valid if and only if it is impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. And this can never happen with an inductive argument. Like all other arguments, inductive arguments try to support a conclusion by offering premises which, if true, support the truth of the conclusion. Since the key difference between inductive and deductive arguments is that true premises in a strong inductive argument offer a high probability that the conclusion is true, while true premises in a valid deductive argument guarantee the truth of the conclusion, evaluating inductive arguments depends on assessing the probability. Premises provide partial support for conclusions in varying degree, depending on the type of argument that we're talking about. Obviously, when we simply make an assertion or a claim about something, without offering reasons, then we don't actually have an argument. So if there's no argument, then of course there's no support. In an inductive argument, we could talk about support being weak, We could talk about it being moderate. We could talk about it being strong. And you can imagine this is on a continuum in that we're using relative terms here. At the very top, we've got the deductive argument, and that's going to offer absolute support. So, what are inductive arguments? I think a fair description that we could apply to a wide variety of non-deductive arguments is an argument that tries to apply what's known about known objects or situations to unknown objects or situations. The general idea of an inductive argument can be stated more precisely with the help of certain key concepts. The property under investigation, the P of the argument, is the property or feature in question. The sample is a group of things that are already known or believed to possess P, and the target class or target population is an individual or group about which we're asking a question: does the target possess P? Now, whether the target's a single thing or a larger group of things, the goal of an inductive argument is to show that it possesses the property in question, and every inductive argument's conclusion attributes the property in question to the target. Now, there are two basic categories of inductive arguments. They may be either analogical arguments or generalizations. The similarities between these two forms of argument are more important than the actual differences between them. So both forms of argument begin with a sample, identify a property of the members of that sample, and then conclude that the property is also shared by one or more items outside the sample. And because of the similarities between the two forms, they're actually evaluated in exactly the same way. So we're going to spend a little time dealing with how you evaluate some of these arguments in just a little bit. Let's start with the analogical arguments. In an analogical argument, the target is an item or a single thing. Say, because Tom is a clown like Dick and Harry, and they both wear big shoes and red noses, then you conclude that Tom must do the same. In every case, the target item is not part of the sample. The target lies outside the sample. After all, by virtue of what an analogy is, you're stretching from what you know to what you don't know. The sample, by definition, is what you know, so the target can't be part of it. The difference between the two consists in the nature of their targets. In generalizations, the target is a class. In other words, a group of things. You might generalize from the fact that humans feel sleepy after big meals to the conclusion that all animals feel sleepy after big meals. In every case, the sample is part of the target class. The target simply just contains that sample. Now, we could talk about having 5 types of inductive arguments, and we're going to spend a little bit of time breaking each one of these down in turn, but we're going to start with inductive analogies, working specific to specific, inductive generalizations, which move specific to general, statistical syllogisms, moving from general to specific, reasoning from the general to the general, which is exactly what it sounds like, and then the last one we'll look at is reasoning to the best explanation, or what we might call abductive reasoning. So let's take each of these in turn to see how they actually work, starting with the inductive analogy, which is an argument that employs direct comparison. As an example, let's take populations of animals bred in captivity to animals that are found in the wild. Those two populations are alike insofar as those born in the wild exhibit unique combinations of physical traits, much like those that are found in selective breeding. So it's likely that nature employs a selection process similar to breeders. All right, and that example was a good one because we were actually moving from specific population to another specific population, and inductive analogies reason from, as we said before, specific to the specific. Now, analogies themselves are not strictly speaking arguments. They're used to construct arguments since they can be expressed as a proposition or a claim. For instance, that 2 or more things share 1 or more attributes, and because they share some attributes, there's a probability that they'll also share others. With an inductive generalization, we're actually going to be moving from particular instances to a universal conclusion, or from specific examples to a general conclusion. So, for example, every football fan from Charlotte that I know or have met is a Panthers fan. So I'm going to conclude that most likely all Charlotte football fans are Panthers fans. The inductive generalization, like we said, moves from specific to general, and here the target is a class or a population. And it's important to have an idea of what will count as a member of a population before selecting specific instances. In fact, it would be impossible to identify members of a group without first knowing something about the group in question. And strangely, this works vice versa. Therefore, it's helpful to have what's called a sampling frame, which is a precise definition of a population and the attribute that we're interested in. A definition that enables you to tell if an individual is part of a population and if it has the attribute under examination. So if we were to ask, what proportion of artists are conservative? We would need to know what counts as an artist, and we would also need to know what counts as being conservative. Say, painters, illustrators, musicians, actors, etc., that hold views X, Y, and Z. From the sample frame, a sample can be selected for examination, and the hope is to select a sample that would be representative, meaning it would represent the real-world situation of the population or class as a whole. Third, we've got the statistical syllogism. Here we're going to be working from general to specific. Yet this is going to fall short of being a deductive argument. If you remember, I described deductive arguments as often moving from general to specific. Here's an example of where that rule doesn't always hold, because here we're having an inductive argument. I'm going to show you the difference in just a second. But here the target is an item from a class. And the strength of the argument depends on the general statement that we start with, the proportion of X's that are Y's. The greater the proportion, the stronger the argument. So for example, most lawyers are crooks. Joe's a lawyer, so Joe is probably a crook. Now, if we're talking about 40% of lawyers that are crooks, the argument might be pretty weak. If we're talking about maybe 95% of lawyers that you can classify as crooks, then the argument becomes a lot stronger. Now, if we started with a universal premise, something that we'd find in a deductive argument, a claim like all lawyers are crooks, then the argument would actually be a valid deductive argument. Again, that's redundant, but you know what I mean. If that premise were true, that all lawyers are crooks, then the conclusion would have to be true and would follow necessarily. So I think you can see the difference between the two types of arguments. And fourth, we've got reasoning from the general to the general, which works just like an inductive analogy. You can reason analogically with respect to populations, not just individual objects. When two populations are viewed as analogs, you can argue about the attributes of one by considering the attributes of another. And the last one is reasoning to the best explanation, or argument to the best explanation, which is an argument that weighs alternative explanations for a situation in order to determine which one is the most probable. For example, if we say we find the front door wide open, how do you explain this? Well, let's take a look at three possibilities. The owner forgot to shut the door, or the door was left slightly ajar and then the wind blew it open, or option 3, somebody broke in. Well, as we investigate, we realize there's no sign of a forced entry. It's not windy outside, so we're going to conclude by ruling out those two options that the owner must have left the door open unintentionally, or perhaps intentionally. Now, this type of reasoning is also called abductive. Sometimes we have to actually make a leap or take a guess based on the data that we have. Another example, let's say little Joey lied about taking the cookies, and we want to know why. Some possible explanations are he likes to deceive people, he didn't remember that he took them, he thought you interpret all propositions as the opposite of what is actually said, and he wanted you to know the truth, or he didn't want to get in trouble. Now, you can go ahead and pick the one that you think is most likely, but again, abduction is a leap based on your current background knowledge. Now, since analogies are so important to understanding the several types of inductive arguments out there, let's take a closer look and break things down a bit further. As we know, analogies deal with comparison, comparing two things. One which is familiar, one which is unfamiliar. And the key to analyzing analogies is to determine what those two things are and how they're similar. If we wanted to capture the form of an analogical argument, we could present it in this really rough way. X and Y have attributes P, Q, R. X also has attribute S. Therefore, Y probably has it as well. We call X and Y here the analogs. Those are the things that are said to have similar attributes. A contrary analog, just to throw this one on the table, is one that shares some attributes but lacks the attribute of interest, S, which we might call the problematic extension. So let's give an example of this as well. Let's say Selena, X, and Barbara, Y, are both college graduates, electrical engineering majors, and are currently employed by Tesla. Let's say Selena makes $80,000 a year. We might assume that it's likely that Barbara makes the same. However, we may have a contrary analog in somebody like Helena, say Z, who also graduated with an electrical engineering degree and is working for the same company, but only makes $50,000 a year. Now, that contrary analog would actually count against our conclusion that Barbara probably makes the same as Selena. So with analogical reasoning, we're actually not trying to gauge the overall probability of the conclusion. That might not actually be possible. Rather, our task is to determine the relative strength of the argument. The relative strength being determined in turn by how similar or dissimilar the analogs are. We'll look a little bit more at relative strength at the end of this video. Let's go a little bit further in discussing the form of the analogy. Like, again, all inductive arguments, an analogy moves from known to the unknown. It works by demonstrating known similarities between two things and then arguing that further unknown similarities exist. Sticking with the example that I just gave, we could break the argument down carefully into its parts and note what is known and what is not known. So for instance, let's say premise 1, X, which we said was Selena, has properties P, Q, and R, which we said were being a college graduate, being an electrical engineer, and being employed by Tesla. Premise 2, we're going to say Y, which was Barbara, has those same properties, P, Q, and R. Those are the knowns. They provide the basis of the analogy. In our third premise, we're going to go back to Selena and note that she has an additional property S, which we said was making $80,000 in salary. The conclusion which we are going to go to is that Barbara, Y, has property S. S is unknown, but we're going to extend it then to Y. So the first two premises demonstrate how X, the sample, and Y, the target, are similar. The third premise demonstrates the property in question, and then the conclusion states that Y, the target, also has the property in question. Now, down the road, we're going to come back around to evaluating analogies, and we're going to deal more with some of this vocabulary like the basis, the ground, etc. But for now, I just want to keep things as simple as possible, just the basics. Let's take another example here. We'll start with a brief paragraph describing a situation, then we'll translate it into a standard form to make it easier to analyze. So here's the example. All 5 of my closest friends bought motorcycles so that they could ride across country together this summer, and they all purchased their bikes from the same cycle shop across town. They're all unhappy with their bikes. I was thinking about going to the same dealer, but now I think if I do, I'll be making a big mistake. All right. It isn't difficult to translate since we already know the standard form and what parts we need to identify. The sample and the target, the similarities that are known, and the property in question, S. Just keep in mind the conclusion is always about the target and is always asserting that the target has the property in question, S. So, proposition 1, my friend's bikes, bought at the same shop. Proposition 2, my bike is going to be bought at the same shop. Proposition 3, my friend's bikes were a disappointment. And then my conclusion, my bike will likely be a disappointment. Always break things down so that they're easy to analyze. This is one of the most important techniques for doing not only inductive logic, but also deductive logic, as we'll see down the road. Now, let's take those propositions and let's go ahead and evaluate. Even though there are several things to consider, they're all going to boil down to, I think, one basic rule, which is the more similar the sample and target populations, the higher the probability that the conclusion is going to be true. Now, each of the individual considerations in your evaluation is concerned in some way with measuring this similarity. So what are some of these considerations? Let's look at 6 rules that I think can guide the evaluation of an analogy. The first rule, the larger the sample, the stronger the argument. If we had 10 friends who bought bikes from the same shop rather than 5, we'd have a stronger argument. Rule 2, the greater the percentage of the sample that has the property in question, the greater the chance that the target will as well. So consider the sample of 10 people who bought bikes from the shop. Suppose 3 of the 10 were unhappy, and then go ahead and suppose 8 of the 10 were unhappy, which would make the stronger analogy. Obviously, 8 out of 10. Third rule, the greater the number of relevant similarities between the sample and the target, the stronger the conclusion. So if all of our friends' bikes were the same make as the one we were considering, the analogy gets stronger. If they all purchase the same model, the same engine side, the analogy gets even stronger. The fourth rule, the fewer known dissimilarities between the sample and the target, the stronger the argument. If all our friends bought one model and I'm considering buying a different model, the analogy would get weaker. If theirs were used and mine's going to be new, the analogy gets even weaker. The fifth rule is when considering a feature of the sample that we are unsure of in the target, the greater the diversity in the sample, the better the argument. So we want diversity. If we don't know, say, the engine size or the drive type in the target, we want a large diversity in the sample. Straight drive, chain drive, different size engines. This gives a greater likelihood that the sample will be similar to the target population. And then finally, the more guarded the conclusion, the stronger the argument. And this is just great advice all around. Consider these two conclusions. Number one, I'm going to hate the bike. Number two, I'm going to be less than perfectly pleased. Conclusion two is more guarded. It's much more likely that I'm going to be less than pleased and horribly unhappy. In other words, two is going to be much easier for me to support. And like I said, this is true of all arguments. Just think of an argument as a table holding an object. The legs are the premises. The object on top is the conclusion. If I have a laptop sitting on a table, then the table's going to hold. If I try to park a car on top, then the thing's probably going to collapse. If I want to support a heavy conclusion, I need really strong premises. Now let's go back to relative strength briefly. Unlike determining the validity or invalidity of a deductive argument, evaluating an inductive analogy is somewhat subjective. The strength or weakness of an analogy is going to depend in part on how relevant and similar the two analogs actually seem to the observer. So instead of immediately trying to determine in some objective way an analogy's absolute strength, it's wise to evaluate it by determining what would make it stronger or by comparing it to other analogies. By comparing the relative strength of the analogy with actual or potential rivals, you can get a good sense of where the absolute strength might be. Another example to illustrate this. You have to speak Sumerian before you can say you know it. Would you believe someone who claimed to know Italian or Spanish and never spoke it? Sumerian is a language just as they are. Break it down like we did before. Premise 1, Italian and Spanish are languages. That's our sample. Premise 2, Sumerian is also a language. That's our target. Premise 3, Italian and Spanish need to be spoken to prove fluency. And therefore, my conclusion, Sumerian needs to be spoken to prove fluency. Now, there are a bunch of questions that we could actually ask here. How large is the sample? How many similarities are there, and are they relevant? Is the sample diverse? And how many dissimilarities are there? So let's go ahead and evaluate a little bit. In this example, the sample is actually pretty small. It only contains 2 languages out of hundreds. An analogy would be a lot stronger if we actually included more languages. The sample is also not very diverse. Italian and Spanish might be different languages, but they're both modern Romance languages spoken in Europe. We could always pick languages from other places in the world. Also, the similarity between the sample and the target, that their languages is relevant, but I think more similarities would be very helpful here. And there's a significant dissimilarity that's not even mentioned. Sumerian is a dead language. Nobody speaks it any longer, while Italian and Spanish are actually very much alive. So I'd say that this is a rather weak analogy. If we'd include other dead languages, like maybe Latin, Ancient Greek, or Sanskrit, I think we'd have a much, much stronger argument. Unfortunately, we don't. So that relative strength, pretty weak. I think that's a good place to stop with this video. We've taken a look at the basics, different types of arguments, analogies, a lot of stuff that we're going to build on in the future videos. Next time, I think we're going to shift and we're going to take a look at the idea of certainty and probability. But until then, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.